Alright, since all the other in-progress back scratches are done, I figure since I have more stuff, I'll make some more. I have another piece of the same highly figured maple that I put on the last curved one, and I figured I'll try some bowling alley floor. I had a piece a little bit longer than that, probably about this long, about this wide, that I had been able to split out and separate from the main giant chunks that I had used on this cabinet, or carving bench, I guess. And I figured, well, we'll try that. So it actually looks pretty cool. It's a similar, I don't know if it'll show up on the video or not, but it's a similar nice grain on one direction, and then same on the other side. So if I put this side either up or down, and those are the sides, similar to this, I think that'll work. This is a little bit wider, but that's okay. I can just round it off and it'll be a little bit beefier handle. I think that'll be alright as long as I get it rounded. Should be anyway. So I figured since I had some extra pieces, or I should say an extra length of the bowling alley floor from the length of the handle, since this was where the nails are, because they actually nail all the different pieces together every 4 to 6 inches. That's why it's so solid. And they also put glue and epoxy and all sorts of stuff down in to try and hold it together. But in any case, since I had an extra chunk after I cut it to length, I cut that up into 4 pieces that should be wide enough or deep enough to make for the curved head piece. And then I had another piece of maple, slightly different, a little bit wider grain, but should still work fine, that I can use for the figured grain piece, like the non bowling alley floor piece. So we'll see how it goes. These will glue up overnight and for the head pieces, and then maybe tomorrow I can set up to cut the slots and glue the handles in. So it was suggested that I try and come up with some way to do a time lapse, because I've gotten some comments that my videos are interesting, but it'd be nice if you could actually see what I was doing. So I had an old computer and monitor just sitting on the shelf, and I had a Logitech camera sitting around, and so I worked and installed the Linux Ubuntu Studio onto the computer. And I will probably need to come up with a faster hard drive at some point, but this is just to see if it even works. Right now it uses a physical hard drive, not an SSD. I think I have a spare SSD in the house, but if I installed that on it, it would obviously run much faster. But so far, what I've done is I've gotten it configured such that it will, because I saw some of the instructions online and this is what's recommended, set up the OBS Studio. It's OBS Studio. So that's the version of it, assuming that shows up on the camera. And basically, you set it up for 10 frames per second. And on the camera, that stutters, but that's okay. It's only 10 frames per second. But the goal is, I have a 20-foot USB cord that the camera plugs into. So theoretically, that's long enough to stretch anywhere I'm normally working. Like if I'm actually working on the project, most likely it's going to be in this area, which is plenty of space. But I have a long enough cord that I can move it to get different angles and such. So I'm going to try and see how it works for doing the sanding on the blocks for the next 2 back scratchers. So I have the handles for that, and then I have the pieces for the heads. And so I'm going to just try and square this up using and recording on there. And then if that works well, I may try and record how I end up doing the slots for, because these need to be squared up a little bit before I can put them on the table saw to cut the handle slots. So yeah, so we'll see how it goes. If it works, oh, I also have it set such that it does not record audio because obviously it's going to have the dust collector and such on, but we'll see how it goes. That may let me do voiceovers, it may not. But in any case, you won't hear the noise from the fans and the dust collector. It'll just be quiet and hopefully something useful. So we'll see. Okay, so first I'm trying to make sure to set the height correctly. And then I realize I need a test block because I don't want to screw up the pieces. And so I measure and try and get the width correct. And then I adjust my fancy little push block such that it'll go. And I make the first cut and it's too deep, so I readjust and try again, and that's the correct height. So then I try it, I believe, on the real piece, and we cut and it is correct. Yay. So we just keep trying to cut more pieces or more slices because you got to get through a whole section, and it's a flat top blade, so it makes a nice bottom to put the handle in. So then I try and figure out and calculate and still manage to screw it up, but I try and calculate the width. And I get the full width, and it's just a 32nd too wide. But I figured, oh well, we'll just, too late now. We'll just do it and go and go and go and get the whole thing, and then it's all ready to go, and the handle fits. There's a space, but we can fix that. Next is the next handle and the next spacer. And this one I'm going to be more careful, and the blade height I had to set, and more careful on the width. So I do another test piece and realize that's way too big. Make a smaller test piece, and I'm more specific and careful about trying to undercut it, because you can always make it wider. It's much harder to make it narrower. You have to fill in and mess. So then I go and set it go, and alright, make a good cut, and then a little wider, a little wider, a little wider, getting close to the end. And a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And it almost fits, almost fits. There we go, it fits. Perfect. The first one I tried was the bowling alley floor, and for whatever reason, there's a gap in that one. You can see it wobble a little bit. So I have to fill that, but that should be fine. The second one did much better. It's actually enough of a friction fit that it stays when I move it around. So for whatever reason, the way I had measured it, it didn't like that, and it went too wide. So yeah. Anyway, the second one, I went under and then crept up on it, which is what I should have done with this one. I didn't. I went to the number, well, I did go under a little bit, but not enough. I missed it by a 32nd. So, yeah. What's a 32nd? Well, that means it wobbles. So, I have this, which is a 32nd thick, so I can jam, when I'm gluing it, I can jam that down in, and that should work fine. So, that should be covered, and that should work just fine. So yeah, next I'm going to glue it, and gluing is boring, so I'm not gonna video the gluing part, but I'll probably video just real quick after it's glued, and we'll go from there. Alright, the gluing is done. This is the bowling alley back scratcher, and the one in the other vise is the other back scratcher. So I think it'll be alright. That was the last big drip that I just cleaned up, so I think we're alright. They are glued up, and hopefully that will work well, and we'll go from there. So, yep. Progress, we're getting there. Alright, the gluing worked fine. We got the back all in there. I drew in some shapes of about how I want the cuts to go. So that should work pretty good. And yeah, then the next thing, cut the shapes out on the bandsaw because this has the small blade, so that does much better with the tight curves. And then work on the sanding and smoothing out and all those bits. But so far so good. Alright, so here I'm cutting the pieces out, and for some reason I only have a video of one of these, but it's basically the same operation. You trim the sides off, top and bottom off, and then that gives you the one side curved shape, and then after that you just go along, and from the handle side you want to cut right before the tip of the hook, because that'll give you the other shape. And it's hard figuring out which direction to put the bandsaw such that it works and you don't cut any fingers and stuff off. But then both of those worked. So, yay. Next, we're going to sand things. So, get the sander set up, the nice 12-inch Harbor Freight sander with the, I think, 60 or 80 grit sandpaper. And I made sure before all this that the table was 90 degrees to the sandpaper because that makes it much easier. And then you just go along and be careful and try not to get your fingers in the sandpaper because you very quickly will have much shorter and much prettier fingernails, assuming you stop in time. Otherwise, you need a Band-Aid. But luckily, no blood sacrifices were done on this, and that one came out good. That was the bowling alley floor one, and then here's the other maple one. I had an extra piece of wood on the back, so we need to clean that off from the glue process, and then work on the one angle, and then just again get the head all shaped nicely, and it works pretty good as long as you take your time. I realize these time lapses are sped up, but as long as you take your time, then it actually does pretty decent job. And you don't, because it's a rough grit, you don't want to jam it in too much because then you have a lot of big grooves to clean off. But if you just go slow and careful, it actually does a nice, fairly smooth job considering how rough the sandpaper is. So then there's that one mostly done, and then we do a little bit on the side, and then that one's also done. And realized I had to do one more section on that one, and then we're it. Alright, so here I'm starting the process of doing the manual sanding and filing of the, I believe this is the bowling alley floor back scratcher. And I have my big dust collector turned on because as I found out in previous things, if I have my downdraft table sitting there and the other hose where you see it in the bottom of the picture, it actually pulls a lot of the finer dust down in versus having it go absolutely everywhere. I mean, some goes over onto the table saw, but for the most part, it does pretty good. So here I'm using a couple different grits, the rough and the finer. You can see there's a flash there of the Rockler rasp set that I got. And it actually is doing a pretty good job. It's getting it fairly rounded off. And now I'm shifting to one of the rounded files, or half rounds. And then I'm using my rough sanding block, and it's getting better. And then I eventually will switch to, you can see there, it's doing a lot better, running along. One thing I noticed at the head on this is I had to eventually take out some of the wood glue that was in the wide gap and replace it with some super glue. So now I use the rough sanding block, the fine sanding block, and now I'm switching over to my Ryobi triangular sander, and it's actually doing a really good job of cleaning things up. And it's actually, you can see it's getting a lot smoother. It's hard to, in some spots, get that sander in place, but with these curves, it actually does pretty well. And then at the beginning, as you saw, I started with no gloves. Then I realized with those rasps, I gotta have gloves on because rasps and fingers don't mix. And there I'm switching. Initially I was on a too fine of a grit, so I moved to a more aggressive grit to get some of the deeper scratches off of the parts, because as anyone who sanded knows, if you start and use a too fine a grit too soon, you will be sanding forever. So it's better to run up through the grits. And there it is. All right, well, I got this one all cut out and roughed in. And I got the one that's made out of the bowling alley floor, mostly sanded down to 220. I know it doesn't show up on the silly phone because that's what the phone does. But there's little bits of touch up yet. But for the most part, it's all good. And that took, I did the time lapse, and doing the roughing from square to round to finish on that took an hour. So at least now I know approximately how long that takes. So there's still a little bit of poking around to finish it up, but for the most part, there's one done, and then the other one I can do next. So here I'm working on doing a test cut because I realized, hey, if I use a router with the half round bit, that may work a lot better. And so it worked on the test piece, which was the same piece of maple that this handle was made out of. So I did the bottom, and that actually came out really cool. It was pretty much rounded off. And then I thought, well, maybe I should do a little bit more with the rasps. And then I realized, hey, wait a second. Rasps are hard on the fingers. Get your gloves on. And I worked on that for a while and did a little more cleanup and made it a little more flat, because ideally, with what I found with the last one, you want to have such that you can tell just by feel which is the back and the front. So I was trying to make the front a little more small as compared to the flat back, so you could tell which one was the front and the back, because it had left the same size flat spot on all the sides. So this way, with doing the files, I was able to do that. And then I did the headpiece, and those worked pretty good. Went through the sanding blocks, the different grits. Did the other side on that one side of the piece, and then light bulb time. Wait a second. The router still fits. That was way easier. Of course, then I had to clean up where the router dinged it. So in the future, as I may have said in the next video piece, that I'm going to try and do the handle first and just leave the part that goes in the head block not rounded off from the router, because then I can actually do it on the router table, and that will be much more convenient and less flaky than trying to use a trim router up in the air. But I did through the 80 grit first and did a lot of the big sanding, and this one I did a lot better of rough grit to fine grit versus having the 220 too soon. But this ended up cleaning up way quick, and it only took about a half hour, even with the screw up with the not remembering to, hey, do the whole handle with the trim router first, because that saved so much time. My goodness, that was like seconds versus 10 minutes for doing the shaping with the trim router. So yeah, I definitely have to remember that for the next time. But this just runs through the grits, and you can see it's getting much smoother, and it's really coming along. And here we go. It's almost done. Almost done. Every time I take it out, that's all the final sanding, because then I can see it getting the head all just good and look for any little bits, and that looks good. I'm working out how to cut in and put the teeth for the back scratchers. So I'm using my triangular file, and I used the spacing for about the width of the tip of the file, and that seems like it did pretty good going across. So I get that going across, and it's important to file the teeth at an angle down towards the handle, such that it actually, well, they feel better if you do that, and they don't look like they're real weird. So it's just a preference. And there I'm using the dust collector to try and suck up the dust. For some reason, the bowling alley floor, the dust tends to want to stick to the part, but you can see the teeth came out pretty good. So now I'm working on the other one, Again, spacing it off with the front of the file and then just cutting those in. And similarly, just going back and forth, getting about the same depth and the same length so the cuts look even. And it should be good. It's almost like I've done this before. But yeah, this worked out pretty well. I like this little triangular file. It's a fairly fine file, but it actually cuts pretty quick and leaves a good surface. Clean it up with your brush, and that one's done too. And the next two are basically done, or at least they have one coat of the polyurethane on. I'll probably put another coat, and then since I have holes in it, put little hanger bits on. But other than that, they're done. And they were both, well, one was a square today and one was a square yesterday. Squared off, shaped but squared off. So I did the rest of it today. So it turns out I found an easier way to do the rounding that sped things up quite a bit, especially if I had done it before gluing it up, is to use a router bit with one of those nice curved side bits in with the bearings. Because that way it just goes zloop and you're done, and zloop and you're done, and it makes it nice and smooth. And yeah, I should have... This one took, with a lot of playing around, about a half hour to round off and get smoothed up. That one, which I did all with the files and rasps and things, took an hour. So if I did this ahead of time, I wouldn't even have to do the handle. That would all be done and rounded more or less from like here up. And then I would just have to do this part. So if I do that ahead of time, I think that'll make it a lot easier. And that'll also let me put the hole in first. And yeah, so I think if I end up doing a lot of these, that's going to be the plan. Square up the handles, figure out which end is for the head, round it all off, and then glue it up and go from there. Because that definitely made it a lot easier. There was way less work on this one than the other one. It's like I said, it took half the time, even with, you know, learning it and figuring it out. But yeah, I think they came out really good. They got the teeth. The colors are good. Colors, well, if you could see it, the colors on there are really nice fancy grain. I don't know, but this, you can sort of see it there. You can see it on the sides. But yeah, for whatever reason, this cell phone, at least the way I've been using it, does not do close-up very well. And this is the one which is going to have lots of glare, of course. But this is the bowling alley floor one. And it actually ends up being really cool too. Again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it because you can't see the grain with this anyway, this video. It just... yeah. But yeah, it's cool. It's more cool on the back side, which again is not going to show up on camera. Maybe I'll do... You can kind of see it... Well, I can kind of see it there, but I think there's a lot of glare in it. Yeah, anyway. The grain looks really cool. That one ends up being fairly heavy. So bowling alley, for whatever kind of maple that is, maybe that's hard maple versus soft maple. Plus the handle's a little bit bigger. But that one is way heavier than this one. So... yeah, but that's cool. It makes it different, and since that one's bigger around, that would be for somebody with large hands. This would be somebody for normal, smaller hands. But I think it's going to work. And I do like this. I like this design, and this has so far been the most popular for the last few, so that's why I made them this shape. But this way works with the grain coming in this direction versus the handle going in this direction, because that way when you do, like I said before, when you do the cuts, it makes this very strong, because when you're scraping it against your back, you're going on side grain, not end grain. So splitting those pieces off by bumping into something, or even just, you know, wearing it down, it's going to wear a lot harder on end grain than it would on side grain. So, yeah, it's very cool. Whoever gets these, I still don't know. So if anybody wants to buy some back scratchers, I have 2 available. But, yeah, I think these worked.